This is the story of Dennis Nilsen, the British equivalent of Jeffrey Dahmer. Now, if you enjoy these kind of true crime content videos, that I ask that you subscribe and turn on the post notifications so this way you can see when I release new stories that are coming out. Without further ado, let's get to it. On February 8th, 1983, a plumbing company is called out to a large home in North London, since the occupants have complained of black pipes and an intense odor coming from the plumbing itself. As the plumber removes the drain cover, he's instantly hit with a horrific smell. And when he begins to slide his hand inside of the pipe, he pulls out a handful of sludge. In it are pieces of what look like flesh, bone, and even a human eye. While this is happening, a tenant from the building comes outside and begins to joke with the plumber to say, "It looks like somebody's been flushing their KFC down the drain." The person saying this is Dennis Nilsen, and he looks the part of a stereotypical accountant. He is well-mannered, he's educated, and very soft-spoken. But under this facade, he's actually a deranged psychopath who has been murdering men and boys. Between 1978 to 1983, it's speculated he's killed between 15 to 16 men and boys. The victims were either young students or homeless men. He would usually meet these men at bars and invite them back to his home. Like Dahmer, he was obsessed with finding a partner that wouldn't leave him. Once a victim was at his home, he would either strangle them until they were deceased, or he would do it until they were unconscious, before drowning them in his bathtub or a bucket of water. His first victim was Stephen Dean Holmes, and on December 30th, 1978, Dennis was out at a local gay bar and sees a young underage boy who's trying to buy beer. Dennis was there, offers to buy the boy drinks, and then he takes him back to his place. And it's at this point that this dark obsession that Dennis has had his whole life really kicks in. And in his mind, he starts to think, "You'll stay with me for the new year, whether you like it or not." This is when he pulls a necktie out of his drawer and he approaches Stephen, who's then lying in bed, and he begins to strangle him. Now, at this moment, Stephen instantly wakes up and attempts to fight him off. The two end up falling from the bed onto the floor, and unfortunately, it's at this point that Stephen goes completely limp. Dennis realizes that Stephen isn't actually dead at this point, he's just unconscious. He then proceeds to go to the kitchen to fill up a bucket of water. Once he comes back and has the bucket, he picks Stephen up, puts him upside down on a chair so his head is hanging off the back of it, and then puts his head into the bucket of water. And minute by minute, he watches as the bubbles stop coming up from the water. In days following the murder, he would dress and bathe the bodies and then prop them up in a chair and would actually watch TV with them. He would speak to them on top of performing other acts. And then once bloating and decomposition would start, he would rip up his floorboards and put them underneath, temporarily saying goodbye to his passive lover. But this wouldn't be the last time that he would see them. Things just continue to get even more sinister. This is when he relies on his skills from the army of when he was younger. In his own words, he says, "In the end, it was when I had 2 or 3 bodies under the floorboards that began to accumulate that come summer, it was going to get hot. I knew it would be a smell problem. I thought, what would cause the smell more than anything else? And I came to the conclusion that it was the inner soft parts of the body. So on the weekend, I would pull out the floorboards and I would find it totally unpleasant. I'd get blinding drunk so I could face it, and I'd start dissection on the kitchen floor. And then I'd go outside and get sick in the garden." Once in pieces, he took the parts outside to his garden to burn over a large bonfire. And I read that in order to mask the smell, he would place tires in the fire, so this way it would try to cover the smell of the bodies. As time passes, this dark obsession begins to nag at Dennis again, where he doesn't want to be alone. He wants someone who's submissive that cannot leave him. This is when he's out one night and he meets a student who's abroad from Hong Kong. During that night, when the two are back at home, he attempts to recreate the same murder that he did to Stephen months prior. As the man is sleeping, he creeps over to the same drawer, pulls out that necktie, and he begins to strangle the man. But this time, the man actually gets up and is able to fend Stephen off to make an escape. Victim reports this to the police. Dennis is questioned, but the victim decides to not move things any further by pressing charges. Nilsen is released. And unfortunately, police see Dennis at face value and they think he's a well-spoken man. Maybe this is just what people within the homosexual community do, instead of taking it seriously. And now, I also think this was perhaps a reason on why the boy didn't decide to press charges, fear of embarrassment. Though it's a shame that police didn't keep an eye on him, because shortly after, on December 3rd, 1979, Dennis meets a Canadian student, Kenneth, and then unfortunately, he strangles Kenneth like he did the first time around to Stephen. And over the years, he would repeat the same behavior, which would come down to meet a man, drink, have relations, strangle, bathe, dress, watch TV, talk to them, sleep together, but each time, all of the men would decompose and would then be forced to leave. But as the body count of victims continued to rise, he was not burning all of the bodies. His go-to spot was putting them still under the floorboards, and of course over time the stench of the decaying bodies was so bad he would have to pull them up one by one. And then once he would segment the bodies and then put them on the bonfire, he would rake out their bones, pulverize them, so this way he had no real trace of the bodies that were left. But then suddenly he gets a surprise because his landlord knocks on the door one day and asks him to move. Because the landlord wanted to do renovations to the flat, asked him to leave. Meanwhile, at this point, Dennis still had 5 bodies under the floorboard, some of which were already partially decomposed. So again, he was on a mission to dismember and burn all of the bodies. After this, he moves to 23 Cranley Gardens, a 1930s home that was divided into multiple apartments, but unlike his past apartment, there was no garden, so he doesn't have the option to have a big bonfire. So with this blockade, he knows he has to stop himself because he cannot dispose of bodies as easily, so he has to be careful. But in March 1982, one of the men he has back at his home passes out from a long night of drinking and is unconscious. Dennis attempts to wake him, but the man is out cold, and as Dennis looks down, he can't resist that urge. He puts a strap around the man's neck and begins to strangle him. This causes the man to suddenly wake up, and this is one of the first victims that really fights back and begins to strangle Dennis himself. He actually came close to killing him, but before he does, he passes out, and he's still not dead. The man is unresponsive, but he's still breathing and moaning quietly. Ultimately, Dennis would have to take 3 separate attempts to officially kill the man. He goes to work the next day with these bruises around his neck, and he just casually makes excuses, and his coworkers think nothing of it really because they think, oh, he's a nice guy, keeps to himself, why would I be concerned? Meanwhile, he's totally covered in strangulation marks. Only a few months later, he would meet another young man when he was out at the local gay bar, and he convinces the man to come back to his house. Hours later, the man would wake up partially stuffed inside a sleeping bag. He looks up at Dennis, who has both hands firmly wrapped around his neck, and Dennis just whispers, "Stay still." This is what he remembers before he passes out. From that point, he then wakes up and sees himself underwater, looking up at Dennis, who's now holding him down. Again, everything goes black, and Dennis repeats the same schedule. Bathe, dress, prop up in the chair, and now enjoy his lover until he decomposes. But miraculously, this man is still not dead. As he's sitting there propped up in the chair, Dennis starts to notice that he's moving slightly. There's some signs of life. So in a very strange twist, instead of trying to kill the man again, he starts to rub the man, who eventually comes back to life and tells the man that, oh my God, you almost strangled yourself in the sleeping bag. I saved you. If it wasn't for me, you would be dead. And the only reason I put you in the bathtub was to help revive you because you were totally out of it. 48 hours later, the man comes back to most of his senses, but is still a little fuzzy about what happened the nights before. As the man begins to piece together the faint memories he has, he goes to the hospital because he knows something isn't right, and this is when the doctor advises him that the bruises around his neck appear to be that of strangulation, and he advises that the man go to the police because the story he was told clearly doesn't seem right. A sleeping bag doesn't cause these kind of strangulation bruises around your neck. Mind you, as he continues to kill these men, there's nowhere for him to actually place their bodies because he can't go out to the garden like he did at his last home. So instead, he begins to dissect the bodies like before, but breaks them down into smaller pieces. So this way he could flush the smaller organs, bones, and flesh down the toilet. Even with flushing though, he's still left with all of the larger extremities, the legs, the head, the arms, torso. Of course, as he continues to flush the body parts down, this is when the pipes become backed up on his end, but also for the other tenants in the building. So you have them complaining to the landlord that something's wrong with the pipes, and then Dennis himself even calls to complain about the pipes himself. This is what leads up to the moment on February 8th where the plumber comes out on site and discovers this sludge. Now, thankfully, the plumber had common sense and knew something is not right here, and he notifies the police, who then test that sludge through the pathology department, and they determine that, yes, this is in fact human remains. The next day, police return to the flat, and they wait for Dennis outside of his building because they know he's going to be coming home from work, and as they see him start to walk up towards the door, they approach him, and they make the decision to not even mention anything about the human flesh or the sludge in the plumbing, but instead they just share their overall concern that they're there to look for a possible health hazard that might be present in the plumbing. So would you mind if we take a look around your apartment? And he doesn't say no. So the police are then able to go into the flat, and it doesn't take long for them to realize that something is very wrong. Inside the apartment, they can obviously smell the remains of humans that are rotting, but they do mention the human remains found in the sludge. And at first, Dennis plays the whole, oh, I have no idea, that's crazy, oh my god. And about after 2 minutes, he drops the routine. This is when police ask where the bodies are, and he points to a wardrobe across the room. But meanwhile, the stench was so intense that they could tell a general idea of where the body was located just based off the smell alone. Police then ask how many bodies are there, and he says, it goes back a long time. I'll tell you, I want to get it off my chest. And from that moment, he was handcuffed and put in the back of the police car. This is where he shares that he's killed at least 15 to 16 men since 1978. After his confession in police custody, he then provided police with memories to help assist the prosecution and the case. So this is where these sad sketches come from that showcase how he treated each of these victims, what they looked like in the moment, how he disposed of them. This, of course, prompts an investigation, and they comb through his home to recover a skull, a severed, partially decomposed head, torso, arms, organs, and various other body parts. After the investigation of his current home, this is when police turned their attention to his former home, which was located on Melrose Avenue. In 1983, police found more than 1,000 tooth and bone fragments in the garden. Police ask him, why did you do this? And this is when he just replies, I was hoping you could tell me that. I want to say that Jeffrey Dahmer said the same exact thing. Throughout the trial, he attempted to diminish as much responsibility about the crimes that he committed as possible, and he relied on the defense that at the time, he thought what he was doing was right. Thankfully, the survivors who were able to get away from the attacks from Dennis were able to come forward and say, no, that's not the case. You seemed cold and calculated. You were completely aware of what you were doing. During the trial, the evidence that was presented was his own confession, his notes, his memories, but also the physical evidence of the crime scene and the tools that he would use. This included the chopping board that he actually would dissect his victims on, the tie he would use to strangle his victims, and even the cooking pot that he had put one of his victims' head in. This is where the photo of a biologist is seen as she's actually lifting the lid of the pot up, looking in at it. Between hearing about how he considered the bodies of his victims as his lovers, and also hearing what he would do to them, paired with the process of how he would dispose of them, jury members were almost literally sick to their stomachs. Throughout the entire trial, he was cold and looked unbothered. On November 4th, 1983, he was convicted of 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. And in 1994, it was made clear that he would never be released from prison. He would spend the remainder of his life reading and writing a memoir, which is basically a compilation of over 6,000 confessional notes expressing, in his words, why he ultimately committed these crimes. In 2018, he would die of a pulmonary embolism and internal bleeding. Fun fact, in 2016, a couple would buy the Melrose Avenue apartment where he would stash the bodies of at least 12 victims under the floorboards and then burn their bodies in the garden. So the couple bought the home, they created a new design, and now they live there. And they even planted fruit and vegetables in the garden that the bodies were burned in. So they're unbothered. Thank you for watching, and if you have any suggestions on any other cases that you would like me to do, please feel free to comment below. I love looking into new cases that I haven't done before. I have a bunch of content that's already been up on TikTok, but I'm open to suggestions. All right, thanks. Bye.